might talk a bit louder. Go on.
Boy, let's get seated and get cracking with this next session. Bang your heads together.
Thanks for doing the hard work for me. Welcome back, and really excited to introduce the afternoon session. So we've all had a good lunch and are sufficiently caffeinated. It is my pleasure to introduce Elizabeth Fearon from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. So prior to this, I understand you did a lot of work in HIV and has transitioned to COVID, as many of us have. So really excited to hear more about the test trace isolate in the UK.
Thanks a lot. And so I've modified the title very slightly because I was a bit worried about saying lessons learned from the UK's test, trace and isolate policies, because I feel like hopefully we're still learning some of those lessons, although it would have been nice if we randomized a bit more. And this is work I'm going to be talking about work that was done by quite a large group of people who took part in this rapid response project from 2020 to 2021, which included epidemiologists and mathematical modelers, as well as behavioral scientists. And our task was really to try and provide advice to policymakers in real time, essentially. I should figure out how to do this. Oh, okay. So over the course of the TTI Project grant, which ran from the end of summer 2020 to the end of summer 2021, I thought it was kind of interesting to plot out some of the topics that we looked at, which were largely driven by questions at the time at each point in the epidemic. So I'm coming at thinking about asymptomatic testing very much from thinking about the whole system of testing, diagnosing, identifying cases, asking them to isolate, tracing their contacts, asking those contacts to do something. Earlier in the epidemic, it was to quarantine. Later on, it became to test. And then move on to the next generation of identifying cases and so forth. And we pretty much after, I guess, Tim's evaluation that he talked about of LFD tests, we started looking at asymptomatic testing in both targeted early on, so amongst contacts in particular, or amongst returning travelers, and then later on, less sort of targeted contexts, like asking the whole population to test twice a week. So I'll talk just a little bit about the motivation for asymptomatic testing within TTI for control of SARS-CoV-2 and just the particular challenges that we have with control of transmission using TTI. And then I'll talk a little bit about some work we did around a targeted example, so daily testing of contacts, which Tim mentioned looking at within the school setting empirically in a trial format, and we've done some modeling of this a little bit earlier. And then I'll talk about some work where we were trying to look at regular screening, so testing people on a regular basis who didn't fit a particular targeted risk profile. We also did some interviews last summer with the population to try and understand a bit better how people were interacting with testing policies. And so I'll just mention those, although I don't have time to go into that with a lot of detail, and how that's kind of informed some of my thinking about questions going forward, both for COVID, and then I'll try and posit just some dimensions that we might want to think about with asymptomatic testing for other infections. So quite early on in modeling work around contact tracing for SARS-CoV-2, there was quite a strong emphasis placed on the importance of timing and reducing delays in the process. And so on the right here, there is this very influential paper by Ferretti et al., which set out the case for digital tracing by indicating that, so in these two panels, the top panel is manual tracing and delays associated with that at each step of the processes I mentioned earlier. And then the bottom one is where they're assuming instantaneous tracing from the point of diagnosis, I believe. And green indicates a negative growth rate of a simulated epidemic. And you can see that in how they modeled this, there really weren't scenarios that had negative growth rates for manual tracing scenarios. We also found this, as did other groups, and we also found that identifying a high proportion of index cases is really key as well. So this meant basically identifying, we were mostly testing symptomatically and then setting off this chain of contact tracing and isolation on the basis of symptomatic testing. And that meant it was really important that we identified a high proportion of those cases in order to set off that chain of tracing. and isolation and quarantine to begin with. But we found that there are real limitations to symptom-based case identification, both because of pre-symptomatic transmission and asymptomatic transmission, contribution to delays in the process where people take a little bit of time to develop symptoms and then decide to book a test and actually take it, but also issues around symptom specificity for COVID and PCR testing capacity constraints. So there was a lot of discussion over the course of the epidemic about the symptomatic testing criteria, whether they were the right ones, what was the most sensitive, but also specific to meet testing demand requirements. All of that was quite challenging. We learned a little bit about exploiting clusters. So we were using a household model to represent transmission both within and between households, and found that you could take advantage within your tracing of the household structure and increase transmission within households. Some people, and we looked at backwards tracing as well, where we try and find infectors of identified cases, not only try and stop forward transmission, and that might help us to find unidentified branches of infection. And then there was some discussion about the role that particularly digital tracing and quarantine may have played in the big drop in cases after the Euros last July, which is in a way a kind of clustering of both time and space. And through all of these and through all of our communications, we tried to emphasize that enabling uptake and adherence was really key. And we tried to look at estimates for those throughout the pandemic, which varied quite a lot. We tried to look at a range, and really if you're at the lower end of that range, a lot of the policies we were asked to compare to each other really didn't matter which you chose because the whole thing was going to be ineffective. So I thought these particular points particularly made the case for asymptomatic testing, but how we go about doing that is perhaps influenced by all of these points. So I probably don't need to spend too much time with this because of what we had this morning already, which is the red line is viral load over time over the course of infection. And then you represent tests with different levels of sensitivity with either higher or lower lines that cross this viral load. So I think we can kind of see, though, that if people start thinking about going for a test a couple of days into symptoms, and if the area under this curve represents potential infectiousness, it would really be useful if we could identify people earlier on. So again, I probably don't need to talk too much about this either, but really it was the provision of lateral flow device testing that made large amounts of asymptomatic testing feasible because of the quick, rapid return and not having to wait to get a couple of days a result from a PCR test, over which time somebody may have become more infectious, and also from a cost perspective. And we've kind of heard about both targeted asymptomatic testing in particular settings, and then over the course of time, this kind of became less and less targeted. And then by the winter of 2021-22, we started to get more advice to test pre-gatherings, particularly in relation to Omicron. So we first looked at the question of the use of lateral flow test within TTI in the context of testing of contacts daily in order to replace quarantine. And the motivation for this is that quarantine of contacts is burdensome. I think it was 10 days at this point, it had been 14. Contacts are at a high risk of having been infected. So in a way, we can, if we're only testing people symptomatically, we didn't used to test contacts as a matter of course. We're not using tracing in the most efficient way to identify additional cases. And so if we are to test those cases, instead of just quarantining them, we might identify more cases and be able to identify more contacts of those cases and so forth. And it was LFDs that, with the rapid return of results, that really enabled this kind of frequent daily testing. The frequency, I think, point has been made earlier by the relatively low sensitivity and the need to account for the changes in viral load over time. So hence the importance of frequency. So we were asked, what's the effectiveness of daily contact testing amongst case contacts compared to a status quo of a 10-day at-home quarantine? And we looked at this for different durations of testing, post-tracing notification. So for 3 days, 7 days, or 10 days. We looked at this amongst non-household contacts only versus amongst all contacts. And then we looked at it with and without PCR confirmation of LFD test. So it used to be that people who tested positive on a lateral flow device were supposed to go for a PCR test and then get a positive PCR test, upon which time they would then be traced, their contacts would be traced and so on. But that obviously adds an additional delay and potential for getting a negative PCR. So we used a household structured branching process model that we developed earlier in 2020, particularly Martin Files was very instrumental in that, in which I think I mentioned we have within household and between household transmission. And then we have a tracing process that goes over the top of this branching process of infection. And this figure just sort of tries to illustrate this. The black lines are infection, the individuals are within these boxes, which are households. And then we have either successful tracing between households or unsuccessful attempts to trace. And so I've just shown the example here of daily contact testing amongst all contacts, both non-household and household. In all of these examples, we assume 100% take up of either the status quo policy or of the daily contact testing. Clearly, that's completely unrealistic to what would happen in practice. There are a wide range of different adherence scenarios that one could imagine, and which we didn't in this particular scenario have time to look at, but are kind of working on. And you might imagine in particular that a motivation for doing daily contact testing is a lack of uptake of testing and adherence to quarantine in the first place. So it's not ideal, but this is what we didn't have any data to inform that comparison otherwise. So along here, we've got a distribution of growth rates of simulated epidemics. Don't look too much at the absolute numbers so much as the relationship between them. And we've got lateral flow tests for 3 days, for 7 days, or for 10 days, and then each of these policies plus PCR confirmation. So we can see that actually we were getting lower growth rates in the daily contact testing modeled scenarios as compared to the status quo modeled scenario. We hypothesized that this might be because it improved onwards tracing and identification of cases amongst household contacts whose contacts would not otherwise have been traced and identified as further cases for onwards tracing and so on. So I think it is quite useful to have a model that can look at generations of transmission when we're looking at contact tracing and testing methodologies. And then in all cases, adding a PCR slightly reduced the efficacy, probably because of the added delay to tracing of identified cases. We found that the duration of testing mattered mostly just if we were looking at both non-household and household contacts, possibly because we needed to cover the duration of the within household epidemic. We did find that the most effective strategy, if we assumed everybody was going to adhere perfectly, would be quarantine of household contacts and testing of everyone. This is obviously the most intensive intervention and is perhaps unrealistic because we're assuming 100% adherence to both of those policies. But in any case, this is sort of broadly what we found around March last year. And I believe that that followed an initial feasibility pilot of daily contact testing that I think was done through Test and Trace. And then there was Tim's study in the schools. And then I think there was another pilot that was being run last summer of daily contact testing through Test and Trace, but I've never seen it reported. So if anybody knows about that, I'd be really interested. So then we were thinking about moving forwards post vaccination in the UK. And there was a lot of concern about what was going to happen in the autumn and winter period, because even if we had a relatively small proportion of unvaccinated, most vulnerable people, that small proportion could be a large absolute number once if prevalence got very high. And if cases started growing very quickly, it could put a lot of pressure on health systems. But there was very little appetite at that point for having lockdowns, which we knew were hugely harmful in lots of ways. And so the question is whether we could have a testing approach to try and reduce the need for having other kinds of transmission reducing interventions that might be much more harmful. So we wanted to look at what's the effectiveness of regular LFD testing amongst asymptomatic individuals and reducing the total number of infections in addition to the symptomatic TTI processes that were running at the time. We wanted to compare that to the percentage non-household contact reduction that would be required. to get the same effectiveness in reducing transmission. And then we wanted to look a little bit at the associated cost in terms of the number of days that people are asked to isolate at home, and then the numbers of tests required. So for this, we used a model called Covasim, which is a dynamic multi-layer network model. There are layers for households, schools, and workplaces, and each of these are repeated daily contacts, whereas the community contact layer is regenerated daily. We based these networks on two contact studies. First, COMIX was being done throughout the pandemic within the UK that measured the number of contacts of different types that people had each day. And then we compared it also with Polymod, which is pre-pandemic. So we used the most kind of highly mixing COMIX that we had at the time, which was from August, September 2020, with a mean of about 6 non-household contacts. And Polymod is a mean of about 10 non-household contacts. We used the vaccination module within Covasim and didn't do much fooling around with it because we weren't looking at vaccination per se. We just wanted to have some immunity represented in our population. And we modeled infectivity as proportional to time since infection. We didn't use an individual viral load trajectories model of infection in this model. That's some further work that we'd like to do, but we used average test sensitivity over time since infection for PCRs and LFDs as estimated by the study that I think Tim mentioned earlier. And we calibrated to a range of different growth rates. The upper end of this range we originally thought was going to be unrealistically high, and then of course we had Omicron, so you never know. It's good to do a range. And then we implemented two symptomatic and asymptomatic testing and tracing pathways. So this is the symptomatic one, and I won't go into it in a whole lot of detail, but people move through, there's a percentage of the population who are symptomatic every day, who then have a probability of testing every day, and then go down contact tracing paths depending on their test results. At this point in the UK, contacts were not being asked to quarantine, so we just had contacts test instead of quarantine, but cases still isolated for 10 days. I think I might keep missing this, sorry. The asymptomatic testing, this issue that Ian brought up earlier about representing lack of adherence to testing, rather than randomly each assigning missed tests across the whole population in the model, we created cohorts where you had a test as per policy cohort, then an intermittent tester cohort, and then about 10% never testing. So these were our results, looking at the effectiveness of asymptomatic testing. With each of these has the same uptake of about 40% of symptomatic test, trace, and isolate policies going on in the background. So this is just looking at the contribution of the asymptomatic testing for a low growth rate, a medium growth rate, and a high growth rate. So I think the medium growth rate is about a 1 week doubling time. And the high growth rate is something like 2.6 or something. Sorry, I meant to put that up on here. So along the x-axis, we have the cohort size or the percentage of contacts reduced, depending on what policy we're looking at. So this is either, as you move across, increased uptake of the asymptomatic testing or increasing contact reductions. And then each of these symbols represents the mean of 100 simulated epidemics for either testing. The blue squares are every 2 days. The circles that are green are twice per week or once per week. And then reduction of contacts is the red crosses here. So we can see that in all cases, once you start reducing a significant number of non-household contacts, you have the biggest impact on reduction of infection, which is not unexpected. But we see the biggest effects for asymptomatic testing at medium growth rates. And if you assume, I think, twice weekly testing, about 50% take up, it's about equivalent to 25% reduction of non-household contacts, which is not insignificant, I think. We looked at person days in isolation, and these increase with increasing testing frequency as people isolate on false positive test results, which is again not unexpected. But I think the thing to concentrate on particularly is the absolute numbers of person days of isolation. This is over 100 days of simulated epidemics. So I think you need to compare an average of, say, 4 days, person days in isolation, to what a 25% contact reduction, say, over the course of 180 days. So you could quantify that exactly, or you might need to do some work to see how people value those things differently. But I think that's how we should compare it. There's some caveats I won't go into for time. And I think I pretty much just covered that. So it's Miguel Silva who's done a lot of work on this. We did a bit of work interviewing members of the public last June or July. And these were some of the comments that they had about lateral flow testing. But I thought what was particularly striking was their personal priorities impacting their engagement with test, trace, and isolate. And particularly, they were interested in trying to protect vulnerable people that they knew, especially family members. And to some extent, they were trying to get on with their life and follow rules and so on. This is a Scottish advert that was particularly nice on somebody lateral flow testing to protect his friends and family. So this has sort of influenced my thinking about important next questions. Some of these are about adherence and uptake and trying to look at that in more detail, particularly thinking about how that might cluster across different communities and cluster on the contact network. I think it's important to try and think a bit about people's priorities were about protecting their friends and family who were more vulnerable. And the way that people reported often using LFDs and were asked to do so during the Omicron wave was before gathering or before seeing vulnerable family members and so on. And that's not something we've modeled here. The twice weekly testing is not that intervention. So I think it would be interesting to try and actually both look at the data on how people did use tests and to try and look at that as a kind of public-driven priority intervention. And I think given what people have talked about with test sensitivity and specificity, and thinking about that in a transmission and dynamics point of view, thinking about metrics for assessment of infectious disease testing would be useful also. I think I'm maybe out of time, but these are some thoughts perhaps for further discussion on dimensions that might affect the usefulness of asymptomatic testing for different infections, different epidemics. Thanks.
We do have a few minutes for questions. We started a few minutes late. So, yeah.
One thing that sort of been concerned with regard to this kind of diagnostic approach is the impact on reassurance. I think you sort of touched on that when you, especially with behavioural. To what extent, if any, is it possible to get that into on what extra information you need?
So, yeah, so that was something that we thought about a bit, particularly earlier with the daily contact testing. And there is some data about that, although it's probably not great data, from the feasibility study, pilot study that was done Christmas, early 2021. Where there was people didn't report more risky behavior after having a negative test, but it's self-reported and all these things, and possibly not that easy to directly quantify. I mean, we could look at trade-offs by increasing the number of within the model by increasing the number of contacts made amongst people who test negative, for instance, and I think it's something that we should look for. Although I haven't fully examined all the literature, but I haven't seen literature suggesting that this is a big effect. If anybody has, please let me know. Yes.
Do you have any idea why the Royal Statistical Society's recommendation in July 2020 that a random sample of household contacts should be selected and each one visited on a random day in the first 5 days of exposure and in the then next 9 days. So, and similarly for the non-household contacts, different random sample, so that we could learn how early in the period of 14 days people actually tested positive.
Sounds very useful.
and because you were going to offer them a test, you were also obviously observing whether at that time they were compliant with the self-isolation or not. Was there any discussion of that?
So I don't know. It sounds like a very useful study. It sounds like a larger scale study than the ATTACK study where they did test people that Tim mentioned as the imperial study every day, which was obviously hugely useful. I have no idea why yeah. My involvement has sort of been via SPI-M, and that was never discussed at the later SPI-M meetings that I was at, but. Well, I generally think that also it would have been useful to have done more randomized studies of different testing approaches like Tim's school study, which really would have, because trying to think now, I'm interested to hear what Mike is going to say about efficacy of asymptomatic testing, because it's very hard to unpick that from so many confounding factors now, but.
We'll save further discussion.
Yeah.
In a little bit, but thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.